You might have noticed that Christians are super interested in the question of whether Christianity is on the rise or on decline. You can find everything from doom and gloom about the death of churches to great optimism and people like Justin Brierley talking about the surprising rebirth of belief in God. People opining that men are going back to church or that Gen Z and Gen Alpha are going to be more religious than ever, and everything in between. But what's often missing in these conversations are just cold, hard facts and statistics presented plainly. That's what I'm going to give you today. Not because I have them, but because Pew Research, the folks who did the Religious Landscape Study, which is one of the most in-depth studies on religion in America, have those answers. And in this video, I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Chip Rotolo all about that study, bearing out what the statistics actually show, whether American religion is going up, down, somewhere in between, and dispelling a whole lot of myths along the way. And if you enjoy content like this, I would really appreciate it if you hit subscribe and consider becoming a patron to help this channel keep going and growing. It's because of my patrons that I can do this at all, so thank you to you guys. What exactly does it mean that the decline of Christianity has leveled off in America? And maybe what conclusions should we be wary of drawing from that?
Well, we know from our data and from Gallup data and GSS data, lots of sources that over the past few decades, we have seen steady decline in traditional measures of religion. Things like religious affiliation, prayer, monthly religious service attendance. That's probably a picture of religion that isn't shocking to people that have been following along. And so that is the backdrop of this. And it's important to keep in mind that there is a big component of religious decline in this report and in this data set. Since the last time we did a religious landscape study in 2014, there's been a 9 percentage point decline in Christian affiliation. So almost a single percentage point every year for the past decade. That's what we mean by steady decline. But as you mentioned, it is the case that over roughly the past 5 years, this decline we are so used to seeing has slowed and leveled off. And to put that a different way, it's essentially a flat line. When we look at the share of Americans who identify as Christian or just religiously affiliated as a whole, when we look at the share who are religiously unaffiliated, we've seen very little change over the past 5 years. And likewise, when we look at other measures that we are constantly following, daily prayer rates, monthly religious service attendance rates, those two have been a flat line. And so this is a really interesting thing to see. It feels like you have to talk about it. I know I've followed stuff online too, and I've seen all kinds of different headlines, and it can be hard to know what to do with this. But I get that people are, excited to see something different, if they have a religious interest. And I mean, just to add to that, it's not that this change has happened in completely normal times. We know that over the past 5 years, the world has been going through the COVID-19 pandemic. When we look at some of our early data from the pandemic, that first summer, among those who regularly attend religious services, just 6% said their house of worship was open and operating like normal. For most people, either their church or other house of worship was closed or was operating with major changes. And so we know the pandemic really shook up how religious organizations were functioning and how they were doing. And so to see such stability on these individual measures of religion is really quite interesting.
It really is. And I'd be curious, on just from the inside, obviously you guys don't have any horse in the race, if you will, as far as what happens. But was there a general sense of just surprise when these numbers came back that, given the sense of overall decline that we've been seeing, how much was this, just a sense of, wait, this isn't what we expected to see in the data? Or was there maybe a general sense that, whether you personally or otherwise, that, I could have seen this coming?
Well, I don't think I could say that I would have seen it coming. And so I do think early on there was some surprise and lots of interest. What's going on here? Is it a demographic thing? Is it a cultural thing? Something else? It's important to bear in mind, this is not a a U-shaped turn where the decline has slowly turned into an increase and that there's a lot of momentum there. It's really a leveling off. And it's not drastically, far off from what we would have expected seeing the decline we've seen for the past decade or two. But it's definitely interesting. And another big part of this report that we were able to surface, we asked some new questions on spirituality, what that means in people's lives. And so I'll just pull together some of those measures. When we look at the number of Americans who say they believe in God or a universal spirit, an afterlife, that people have souls or spirits, or that there's something spiritual beyond the natural world, 92% of Americans have a spiritual outlook. Now, because some of these questions are new, we don't have great long-standing trends on spirituality to say whether it's going up or down or staying the same. But I mean, that's more than 9 in 10 Americans. And so trend aside, that's really interesting. I mean, when we were first unpacking these results and I was making social media posts, one of my things was like, can you think of anything that 92% of Americans agree upon? And so we have to be very careful in not overstating what we can take away from the data. But it's certainly interesting to see this widespread spiritual belief and some sort of change from what we had been seeing with religion.
That is really fascinating, and I'm not sure I can think of anything that 92% of Americans share in common. So that's a fantastic, really interesting stat there. You mentioned, we've got to be careful not to conclude too much from this, and you also made a point to say that we're not seeing like a U-shaped graph, which I think is important because I do think that some people have interpreted this as like Christianity's making a comeback. I know already there's been books written about like the rebirth of belief in God, and some of those are based on statistics. Others are more, I want to say, like kind of vibes based, if you will. But I wonder, as a sociologist and someone working at Pew, what kind of advice could you give for people as they're kind of trying to read and interpret studies like this? I mean, you and the team at Pew do a great job of breaking this down. You don't just like give us this giant, how many pages is this thing? It's like a couple hundred, right?
Yeah, right at around 400.
Yeah, nice little short beach read for people this summer. But you
Right.
guys break it down really well. But, for people who do want to try to understand what's going on, if they have some type of vested interest or just are genuinely curious about the state of religion in America, what kind of advice could you give people as they try to engage studies like this to avoid making conclusions that aren't warranted by the data and also be able to kind of read it in ways that are helpful to them?
Sure. Well, first I can say, I mean, this is a religious landscape survey, but we brand it the religious landscape study because it is a package. We have a follow-up survey that's in the works now, and we're continuing to put out more reports and analyses from this data. So if you go to the religious landscape website, you will see this big 400-page report, but there's a nice 2-page executive summary that's kind of like a very similar to a press release that highlights some of those main takeaways and findings. We have an interactive database on the website where you can actually play with the data yourself. So pick a state, pick a religious group, pick a measure, and it'll auto-populate bar charts for you. So you can go in and look for exactly whatever it is you're interested. And even though the report is 400 pages, it's broken down pretty clearly into chapters. So if you want to see rates of religious intermarriage or views about the environment or abortion, I think it's pretty straightforward to find that. And we're continuing to do different types of media productions from this. We've done some short videos highlighting findings. And so I think as a team, we're trying to make it easier to get to the points that people are probably most interested in finding. I'll add to that, with a 400-page report, it might seem like we have said everything we could possibly say about this data until we ran out of breath. But the reality is really more like the opposite. These 400 pages are almost like the things that we had to say to make the findings clear. And so every chart you see, every paragraph, every claim has been carefully thought through by our research team. and said in a precise way. And if you say it a slightly different way, it might not be true anymore. So just like we were talking about with the title, that religious decline has slowed down and has leveled off. That doesn't mean it has grown, but it is true that it has leveled off, that's a change from what we've seen. And so, again, it's just important to qualify the kinds of things we see. Last thing, charts are your friend. Pretty much anything in our reports you see, the text is giving context and interpretation to the charts, but the numbers mostly speak for themselves. And so we have people who like to learn in all kinds of different ways. I often refer people to charts.
The charts really are so helpful, and you all have done such a fantastic job putting together all of this data. I was recently just going through and was incredibly interested to see the actual statistics behind things that were really surprising to me. And not that we'll get into them necessarily here, but comparing, say, like the political views or even various uh, religious views of groups that I would think are very different. Like I was going in and looking at Catholics and Episcopalians on different like social issues and finding that the numbers were way more similar than I would have thought, which if for nothing else, I think the study does a good job of kind of maybe getting us out of certain rhetorical echo chambers and seeing like, but what does the data bear out about real people on the ground? On this point about data, I do want to ask because I know that so many people might be kind of like waiting with bated breath after seeing this level off. When is it that people could expect to see more data from Pew as far as what's happening next? Will it be every 7 years? Is that when we'll get the next kind of full study? And will there be things in the kind of intervening period where we'll be able to get a sense of like where's the graph going next?
Sure. So, I mean, this was our third religious landscape study, and they have happened roughly every 7 to 10 years. Part of it depends on the bandwidth of our team. Part of it depends on funding and other things. For a study of this size, researchers, reporters, people of all sorts with interest will continue to use these estimates for years to come. And as you mentioned, just the sheer size of this study, nearly 37,000 respondents, allows us to see a lot of smaller groups like Protestant denominations that in standard national surveys, we just don't have the statistical power to see. So these estimates will remain relevant for years to come. But in terms of trends and what's happening at the national level, we bring in some other surveys that we regularly conduct. And even in this report, to say that we've seen stability in the past 5 years, we brought in our NPOR survey, our National Public Opinion Reference Survey. That's a study that's conducted annually. And it's a lot smaller than the religious landscape study, but has a very thorough methodology. People can complete it online, by phone, or a paper. And the weighting is very meticulous. And so we often use what we get on that survey as benchmark estimates for all kinds of things. And, it's June now. We actually should have the data back for 2025 very soon, and we'll have to analyze it and everything. But as you can imagine, I am right there with you. I am super interested to see if the 2025 data shows any signs of growth on these different religious measures, or more religious decline, or more stability. It will be interesting. We do make a point in the report that even though we see this stability, we would expect to see more religious decline in the future based on demographic things, like the fact that older Americans tend to be more religious, and as they pass away and younger Americans make up a larger share of the population, just by virtue of the fact that they tend to be less religious, we would expect the overall composition of the United States to be less religious. But you never know. We have to just wait to see what the data shows.
We will have to wait indeed. And on that point of the expectation of further decline, there was something that you highlighted in other appearances, as well as I watched a video that you did for Pew on this, that was really interesting to me because it seems to kind of dispel a myth that is believed widely in church circles. And that is that, look, like these young people, they go off to college, they leave the faith, but don't worry, they're going to have kids and come back. When they get older, they're coming back to church. That's just the way it works. Can you talk about that for a moment? Because it seems like the data is bearing out that that's not the way it works on average in most cases, that as people get older, despite the fact that older cohorts are more religious, it doesn't seem to also follow that as younger, less religious cohorts get older, they will become more religious. Is that fair? And could you kind of touch on that for a second?
That's right. And I mean, it's important to keep in mind that every individual person has their own unique experience, and their experience could counter what we see when we're looking at the national average. All kinds of different things happen in people's lives. Um, but on the whole, and this is with our 17 years of religious landscape data, there is no age cohort that shows signs of becoming more religious as they age. So by cohorts, I'm just referring to people, their birth decade, born in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. So we have people at all different stages of life. But when we look at religious affiliation, when we look at uh, church attendance, when we look at prayer, we don't see signs of growth as people get older. The other thing we knew about young people is not only are they less religious today, but using our survey data and the things we've asked them, they convey that they also had less religious upbringings than older Americans. As children, they were less likely to regularly attend religious services. They were less likely to have religious schooling or other types of religious education. They're less likely to say religion was important to their family. And so just thinking broadly about religious socialization and all types of socialization that are really important for children and influencing the trajectories they eventually go on. Um, Everything points to the fact that younger adults are less religious. They had less religious socialization, and um, there would just be nothing to suggest that there would be, from the data, a major rebirth of spirituality or religious engagement.
And this brings us to this idea of stickiness, a term that Pew uses, which I think is really interesting. And as I understand it, it refers to basically the extent to which a religious identity is maintained over time. Perhaps we could say it something like that. And it seems to be the case that those who grow up non-religious, that non-religious identity is fairly sticky. In other words, there's not these large swaths. Again, individual experience, can always be different, but on a whole, it doesn't seem like any particular Christian group is growing a ton by like adult conversion from people who had a non-religious identity as a child. Is that fair? And kind of what implications might that have as we're talking about this, as we talk about like the stickiness of identities? It also seems, I'll just highlight to throw in the blender of things to think about in this response, that religious identities are seemingly less sticky than non-religious ones, that more people, in other words, are going from religious to non-religious than non-religious to religious. How does that all sound to you? Am I characterizing it fairly? And can you maybe shed some light on it?
Sure, that's right. And this is tricky stuff, especially when you add in terminology. And so a bunch of our report talks about one, religious switching, by which we mean people switching between different religious identities, including non-religion. So we're looking at what people said they were raised with religiously, that identity. And then when they take this survey, what it is now. Has it changed? If so, that's religious switching. And that has overlap with what you referred to, which is religious stickiness. Who sticks with their religion? What are the retention rates of these different groups? And on the whole, there is one group that has much greater net gains through religious switching than anyone else, and that is the religiously unaffiliated. For every one person who grows up non-religious and then becomes religious, there are 6 people who grew up religious and have now become non-religious. So just from a ratio standpoint, this group, the religious nones, N-O-N-E-S, is gaining a lot of people through religious switching. And maybe I should just backtrack and for a second say there's a lot of religious switching in the United States. 35% of Americans convey some form of religious switching, which equates to like 90 million people. So there's a lot of switching happening. On the other hand, while the unaffiliated are making gains, Christian groups have been losing through religious switching. So 6 people have left Christianity for every 1 person that joins Christianity. And when we look, I have lots of data here. When we look within Christian subgroups, we see the largest losses are for Catholicism. So there's about 8 people who leave Catholicism for every 1 that joins. I think the actual number is 8.4. And for Protestantism as a whole, there's about 2 people who leave for every person that joins. And so a lot of movement there that really shakes up the religious landscape. In terms of the flip side of that, which is retention, people who stayed within their religion, about 70% of Protestants have retained their religious identity. So they grew up Protestant and they're still Protestant. That number drops to 57% among Catholics and 54% among Latter-day Saints. So we see that there's some considerable differences there. But, for Protestants, 70% is relatively high. That's similar retention rate to the unaffiliated. A group with the highest retention rate is Hindus at 82%. And so there's a lot going on here. But to get back to some of your original questions, yes, in terms of which religions are more sticky, an unaffiliated, a non-religious religious identity tends to be more sticky. And we see that with younger cohorts, it's becoming even more sticky. Someone who was born in the 90s and didn't have religion is more likely to stay non-religious than someone born, say in the 50s or 60s. And likewise, those born with a religious identity, the younger generations, that's less sticky. They're more likely to leave it and switch to something else. So lots of interesting stuff going on. And a big component is what we see across different age cohorts.
That's so fascinating to me. And I definitely want to hone in on this topic of religious switching here a little bit, because a lot of my audience are people who have undergone religious switching, specifically kind of within the Christian tradition, especially. But it's no surprise to me to hear that a lot of people are switching from one tradition to another. And it's really interesting to me because the data that's borne out in this study is very different than the kind of rhetoric that I'm hearing in the circles I'm in, but that's going to be influenced, of course, by what people are interested in the circles I'm in, right? And so if people are really passionate about the fact that, they've switched from Protestant to Catholic, they're probably going to find content similar to that. They're going to be the ones making content about it. Whereas if you simply lost a religious identity, maybe you're not spending all your free time making videos about it. Or maybe you are, and they're just not the videos I'm seeing. But one quick question I wanted to ask you about that before a different follow-up is, within the religious switching data that you guys are pulling, is it purely quantitative data? This person went from here to here. Or are there any, whether in this study or others, is there any data being gathered around why did you do that? Or, kind of questions like that. Is it purely quantitative, or do we have anything else accompanying this religious switching data?
Well, for this religious landscape study report, it is purely quantitative. We asked them what their childhood religion was. We have a kind of technical method for doing that. We ask them their denomination, and then we have some follow-ups about whether they identify as born again, and then look into their specific denominations. And then we ask about their current religion. So we're just looking at differences between those. But we are doing some follow-up work to this initial survey that hopefully will get more into the whys for people's religious switching. So I don't have that data yet, but hopefully we will have that soon.
Awesome. I'll be really interested in that, and might have to follow up with you when that comes out, because I imagine that will also have surprises, right? Depending on what people are used to, they might think that religious switching is always, going in this direction motivated by X, Y, or Z, and in the other direction, it's always motivated by A, B, or C. And something it seems to hold generally true is that life is complicated, and there's probably more factors at play than people might assume there. You spoke about it a little bit about the directions of religious change and what that's looking like, but I want to maybe drill down into that a bit more, and specifically within kind of switching inside of Christianity broadly. So it sounds like the majority report is there's a backdoor problem, if you will, for Christianity, that more people are leaving than coming in, insofar as, you consider that a bad thing, you're going to call it a problem. I'm not committing you to calling it a problem. But within that switching, so you were saying that the Catholics are kind of losing the most. Do you have any data on whether that Catholics are losing the most people to, is it primarily going to kind of like nuns, or is that to other Christian groups? Is it some type of mix? And if you don't have that data handy, that's completely fine as well.
No, we have that data. I have lots of sheets here, so it might take me a second,
Awesome.
but um, 57% of Catholics still identify with their childhood religion. So that was the retention rate that I referred to earlier. But of those who have switched, about a quarter, 24%, are now religiously unaffiliated. 14% now identify as Protestant. And then very small shares in the ballpark of 1 to 3% identify with a different religion. And so, the greater share of people who are switching out of Catholicism are going to non-religion, and that's the case for Protestants too, and Protestant denominations we can talk about. But yeah, 14% of people who were raised Catholic have now become Protestant. And just for comparison, when it comes to Protestants as a whole, 70% stay within that, as I mentioned. 22% have become non-religious. Just 2% have switched to Catholicism. And there is a big share of Protestants who are switching within Protestantism. So we actually have that top level for Protestantism as a whole and switching in and out. Then we can actually look at the denominations too. And I guess you have to ask the question of what a meaningful switch is, or why people might be switching to different denominations. Say, hypothetically, you grew up Baptist and then you moved across the country where there were no Baptist churches like yours, and there was a Methodist church up the street that, as far as you could tell, had nearly identical theology. Is that a religious switch? Or I guess the better question is, in what ways is it a religious switch, and what does that move really mean? But there's a lot of switching of Protestants within Protestantism. At the high end, Baptists have a 54% retention rate, which is pretty close to what we saw with Catholics, and 23% switch to a different Protestant denomination, 17% leave religion altogether. For most other Protestant denominations, about a quarter are becoming non-religious, and then we see all kinds of different rates of switching to different Protestant denominations. So let's see here. 32% of Methodists go to a different Protestant denomination. 29% of Presbyterians. At the high end, 50% of people who were raised in the holiness tradition switch to a different Protestant denomination. So all kinds of things could be going on. It could be things like geographic mobility, which I mentioned. The availability of different types of churches across the country can make a difference. There might even be demographic. Well, there are demographic factors playing in. People in certain denominations might be more or less likely to have upward mobility, to go off to college, to have certain types of jobs that might, make them more likely to have some sort of religious switch. And so, lots of really interesting data here. And it kind of, it doesn't give you a full why, but in the way that we hope some qualitative data will, but just kind of looking at these switches and where they are going to can kind of give you a sense of what might be going on.
This is so fascinating on very many levels. First, the very small, I believe it was 2% of Protestants going to Catholic, reflects my lived experience, but not my online experience, which is just an interesting kind of dichotomy there. That, what I've experienced in my life is I haven't known many Protestants personally who became Catholic, but there seems to be a very vocal movement of those who become Catholic from Protestantism online, which again, algorithms do all types of stuff to serve us, what we might be interested in seeing, which can distort the way we see the world, which is why these statistics are so helpful. The one of the other things that I found interesting here was this, as you talk about like the switching within Protestantism and how that's conceived. I'd be fascinated in kind of the qualitative data, and this might even be something that, I don't know how you would measure it, but whether or not people who switch from Protestant identities feel like they've undergone a religious switch. Like, we use that as a technical term here, right? That you grew up Methodist and then you became Baptist. That's a religious switch. I'd be just genuinely fascinated to know in the future sometime whether those people see it as that, right? Or it just feels like, oh, I went to this church and now I go to that church, and they're all churches, and it's all the same. So that would be an interesting thing to bear out in the future, I think.
Yeah, we don't have data, exactly on that yet. But one thing that comes to mind is when we ask people about their religious identity, we always give them a chance to say something else other than the things listed on the survey, and they can write things in. And hundreds, even thousands do write things in. And then we have to have this really comprehensive and technical back coding is what we call it, to code those responses back into the categories that make the most sense for them. Because sometimes, there will be an option that says Baptist and someone will write something else and then they write Baptist in, or there are people who are Protestant, but don't, identify as Protestant. They just identify with that denomination. And so this is just all to say that you're right. People have all kinds of different ways of conceiving of their own religious identity, and it may not fit into these exact categories. We have people that write in follower of Jesus Christ, which, we know is one way of indicating that they are Christian, but people have very specific ways they like to think about their own identity. They are complex and nuanced.
They sure are. And speaking of that complexity, there's two follow-ups on this idea of Protestant, I think, generally, that I want to talk about within the study, because if I recall, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you all make a distinction between like mainline traditional Protestants and I think you have evangelical in there as well, which is an interesting term because it's non-denomination. So I'd be curious how you guys are kind of filtering that. And then also this question of non-denominational. I believe that falls under Protestantism. But how does that all work together? Maybe like take us behind the curtain a little bit to figure out how you're delineating some of these things that I imagine could be messy, because I could see some non-denominational Christians not saying they're Protestant because they don't maybe institutionally affiliate with anything other than a non-denominational church. So take us behind the curtain there.
Yes. Well, I'll start by saying we have an article about this on our website that explains it probably much better than I will now. And so anyone that's curious can look and see. I'm blanking on the name, but if you were to search for Pew and how we code religious identity, it will come up pretty easily. So the approach we use for the religious landscape study is what we call the denominational approach. We basically get down to what people's denomination is, if they have one. So we ask them first a question about their religion as a whole. And then if we find out that they're Christian, for example, we ask them if they have a specific denomination: Baptist, Methodist, Episcopalian, and so on. And even once they answer that, they're filtered into a follow-up. So if you said you were Baptist, you would get another question asking, are you Southern Baptist? Are you American Baptist, National Baptist, Cooperative Baptist, and so on? And so when we finally get down to the level of the most specific denomination a person identifies with, we back code that based on knowledge we know about those denominations. We have lists of thousands, and based on our knowledge about those, we code those as theologically evangelical Protestant, mainline Protestant. We have a historically Black Protestant tradition. Those are our main Protestant groups. Then we have Catholicism. In this study, we're able to look at Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, and so on. And eventually, we get down to a something else category that holds all the people that are in teeny tiny groups that we just don't have the sample size to analyze separately. So that's one way that we code religious identity and come up with the groups that you referred to. Another thing that we do on our American Trends Panel surveys that we're regularly conducting throughout every year, if we don't have denominational information, is we ask people their religion and we find out what that is, including if they're Protestant or Catholic. And the main back coding comes in identifying people as Protestant. So we ask them a question about whether they identify as born again or evangelical. And if they are white and they identify as born again or evangelical, we code them as white evangelical Protestant. If they're white and they say they're not born again or evangelical, they get white non-evangelical Protestant. That category is not exactly synonymous with mainline, so that's why we call it white non-evangelical, but there is a lot of overlap there. And then if you're a Black Protestant or Hispanic Protestant, we keep those groups separately just because we know historically and in terms of traditions, there are some differences there, which you can see across all kinds of religion and political questions. So that's the gist of how we code it.
That's fascinating. It's a little glimpse into how it all works, which I'm sure the sheer production of making this, it has to be astounding. One last question, I think, on stickiness that I'm not sure we got to, but now that we've kind of fleshed out some of these distinctions, even within Protestantism here, were there any general trends? Are evangelical identities stickier than mainline identities within Protestantism, or was that data pretty similar? If that's a question that can be delineated.
Yeah, the way we report on this is just Protestants as a whole and then denominations. And so it kind of gets tricky because even within those denominations, Baptist, Lutheran, and so on, we have a more evangelical traditions, evangelical versions of those, and non-evangelical or mainline. So on the whole, I don't know that. The fact that Baptists have the highest retention rate within Protestants generally alludes, I think, in some ways that evangelicals may have a higher retention rate, and some of the denominations we see that tend to be more liberal, left-leaning, progressive, they tend to have lower retention rates. And I think that jives with a lot of other data we see. So that's what I think about that. There is one thing I wanted to bring up, and I'm going to slip my mind. So we talked about how there is one main group that is net gaining through religious switching, and that's the unaffiliated. That's true on the whole, but when we actually get down into some of these smaller Protestant subgroups, there's actually one that is gaining rather than losing, and you mentioned them a little while ago, non-denominational Protestants. There's not a ton we can say about exactly the characteristics of that group and who is in it, but non-denominational Protestants are gaining people at a 3-to-1 ratio. It's important to keep in mind that on the whole, non-denominational groups are pretty small. And so the ratio is interesting and it's there, but size-wise, it's pretty small. I think, let me see the numbers. Well, I'll give you another group. So there's non-denominationals. There's also a something else religious category that I mentioned. That includes a lot of, all we can call them is liberal faiths, Unitarianism, New Age spiritualities. That group is also making some net gains. But to put it in perspective, 1.8% of Americans have joined one of those something else religions, whereas 0.3 have left. That's a 6-to-1 ratio. That's still technically a lot smaller than the 22% of Americans who have left Christianity and the 4% who have joined. So from a ratio wise, there's definitely something intriguing happening there. It's just a much smaller group. We can also think, well, people of all ages are telling us about their childhood religion and their adult religion. Some of these New Age faiths and non-denominational groups may have been less available when they were children, hence more people joining over the course of their lives than leaving. But just to throw out another data point there that kind of shows something different from the larger trend, it's really interesting. It seems to be all the religious identities that are somewhat nondescript and a little bit harder to characterize, because we also have a non-specific Protestant group that's making slight gains, but it's just like, it's interesting that those are the ones that are gaining, whereas all the other ones are losing people.
That is fascinating. And in a way, and now this might be a generalization that isn't warranted, but it would seem to map on to the disparity between the spirituality of the American populace, if you will. The 92% have some type of spiritual outlook or worldview, and the declining, even if it's leveled off, religiosity of America. So I could see those things, even if we couldn't like prove it out in the data. At least they seem to bear a family resemblance of having kind of vague edges to them. Um, but I don't know. I'll test that claim right now. Does that speak to you of going too far, or what do you make?
Well, again, I mean, just sticking strictly to the data, we can't say whether spirituality is on the rise. In a spirituality study we did a year and a half ago, one of the big things we found is that for most people, religion and spirituality overlap. Most people aren't seeing them as contradictions. And so, we hear all the time about the spiritual but not religious. There's a subset who think about things that way and have spiritual identities while rejecting more organized religion. But most people who are religious are also spiritual, and most people who are spiritual are also religious. I think that holds up. So there's a lot of overlap there. So that's the main thing that comes to mind. I guess I can say one thing that comes to mind from that spirituality survey. We did see among people who identify as spiritual some slight differences in terms of what they think spirituality means. So everyone who said that they were spiritual was asked a follow-up question about what is essential to spirituality to them, and were given all kinds of different options. And the top thing that older Americans who were spiritual associated with spirituality was belief in God, a belief in something higher. But when we looked at the youngest cohort of Americans, actually 18 to 29-year-olds in this case, who are spiritual, the thing they were most likely to say spirituality means is being connected to my true self. And so if you think about it more as a personal or individual or introspective thing, many of them also said being connected to God is a big part of their spirituality. But on the whole, there were some differences by age in terms of the things they associate with spirituality, potentially, as opposed to religion.
That's fascinating, and wants to make the less exacting part of me run wild with unwarranted conclusions about what that could mean. But I'm not going to do that. But that is just a really interesting data point for reflection. I do want to stick with this youngest cohort, though, because that's an area of this study that seems to have gotten lots of attention as well. So if, one reading of the Cliff Notes version of the study, or just, read the title and nothing else, was that Christianity's making a comeback. And we've talked about why that's probably not quite the way to read it. But nevertheless, that exists as an interpretation out there. A second seems to be the kids are coming back, if you will. I see people talking about getting really excited about maybe some surprising findings in this youngest cohort. So let's start with the data, as is good to do in such a thing. What is it that Pew found in these youngest cohorts? And we can talk about who they are, what age groups we're talking about here, and what were some of the surprising things that maybe we can get into what that does and doesn't mean.
Yes. Yeah. So just to reiterate, what we're talking about with cohorts is people's birth decades, born in the 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. And our youngest cohort is those born in the 2000s, specifically 2000 to 2006. You had to be at least 18 years old to take our survey. And so that youngest cohort isn't a full decade. It's 18 to 24-year-olds. And what we're used to seeing when we look at cohorts by religion is that each successive cohort is at least a little bit less religious than the one that came before it. And in the social science of religion literature, this is called generational replacement. And it's one of the main explanations about how religion declines over time, that each successive cohort is a little bit less religious than the one before it. But one of the interesting things that people are seeing and intrigued by, us too, is that this youngest cohort of those who were born in the 2000s looks almost identical to the cohort that came right before it, those born in the 90s. When it comes to religious affiliation, saying religion is very important in their lives, attending religious services regularly, praying, there really aren't significant differences there. And so qualifying that statement, it's not a sign of growth or that they're somehow way more religious than those who came before them. But it's interesting that we don't see that same pattern of decline there. And I'm sure, there's going to be a lot of interest in doing more follow-ups on that. And one related thing to that people have been talking about, and maybe we can bust some of the myths around it. I see this on social media all the time, is that young people, specifically young men, are flocking back to religion. That is also not quite the case. So what we see is that historically, women have been more religious than men on a variety of measures. I think if we look at the cohort of those born among those who are 75 years old or higher, women are 20 percentage points more likely than men to say they pray daily. But among 18 to 24-year-olds, that youngest cohort, that gap is only 4 points. And so what we see is that this long-standing gender gap appears to be narrowing, that women are not way more religious than men, to put it in simple terms. But the reason for that is not actually that men are somehow really excited about faith and coming back to religious communities. It's actually that women are becoming less religious at a faster rate. To put it differently, they are catching up to men in the decline of religion. And so that's why the gender gap is closing. And it's a really, really important distinction to make, because it's kind of the opposite of what some people might think is happening with the data.
Oh, both of these things are so fascinating. And it's so easy in talking to you to see how these things can happen, right? Like, you take a factual statement that perhaps the youngest cohort is, hasn't declined in their religiosity at the rate expected or something like that, right? Hasn't followed that trend. And then you sensationalize this for clicks in a kind of economy that's driven by that, and say, like, Gen Z bucks the trend and goes back to church. And it's like, not quite, but like, you see how someone gets there. Or this idea with men, there does seem to be this sense that, like, yeah, young men are flocking back to the churches. And you'll see, I've seen op-eds about this, right? Like with the Orthodox Church, especially, like young men are becoming Orthodox in droves, or like, young men are really becoming Christian. But it's really interesting to hear that, if we look at the data, it's not so much that they're becoming more Christian, but that the women are becoming less Christian faster. And I wonder, just on this point, how, like, what advice do you have for people to sift through claims like that? Like, because people who watch this video are going to see in their recommended videos, perhaps on this very ones with titles that sound a lot more sensational like that, right? And how can we vet claims like that young men are becoming so much more religious, or that, Gen Z is going back to church? What advice do you have for people as far as, like, seeing a claim and testing it against what you find in Pew?
Sure. Well, I'll tread lightly here, because we also tend to avoid commenting on other people's works, whether it's academics, other researchers, or the media. And so I can tell you what we're going to do. Like, having seen this idea out there, a way we think about it is we have to make this more clear to people. Maybe our report wasn't sufficiently clear enough to keep people from straying and making claims that can't be said. So I'm hoping here soon we can actually write up a short article that will kind of explain these patterns and exactly why they mean what we discussed, and not some of the other things that people are claiming. But I mean, it's important. I think all the time, I regularly try to make Instagram posts and reels where I discuss some of the findings of our study and put them in simple terms. One of the things I'm hoping to do, and that Pew has done in the past, is something like a polling 101, how can we help people be more diligent readers when it comes to seeing public opinion data out there, whether it's a Pew report or something on the news or something they see just scrolling through their phone. One of the things that can come up a lot that I think, someone who might be new to this just isn't aware of is margins of error. When you have a survey of this size at the national level, the margin of error is 0.8 percentage points. So these are really precise estimates. But if you were to look down at the state level data, because there's much smaller groups in each state, the margins of error might be 6 or 7 or even higher percentage points. We try not to report on anything that's getting like to be 10 percentage points or more. But at the same time, anytime we can report on small groups, we like to do that. So there is some data. And so it's just being really careful to observe not just any given percentage, but all the details that are around that. If a number is 60% identify as this, like what is the margin of error? Could it be 5 points higher or lower than that? And same when we're looking at trends. What are the margins of error of past trends? When we trend data, the questions have to be worded the exact same and they have to have been asked in a similar context. So all kinds of other biases and effects don't come in. It's tricky. And yeah, we've done a short course on this sort of thing before. I hope we can do more of that. But be a diligent consumer of polling data. Read the notes at the bottom, the tiny footnotes. Everything that's included will probably be telling you something interesting. And, the titles and things like that, we don't just write something to put there. Usually we are highlighting the kind of finding you should be taking away from a chart.
Chip, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time on this. I want to wrap up with a final question. And feel free to take this in any direction, but we've obviously only scratched the surface. I mean, you've pulled tons of data, and yet there's so much more. We've talked about some of the headlines that are coming out of this that maybe might not be helpful. We've done some myth busting. We've covered a whole lot of ground, but I know there's so much that we haven't even touched at all. I'd be curious, just from your perspective, as people go away from this, obviously a link to the study will be in the description to this video. Is there anything that you think, hey, this is like a hidden gem, if you will, of this study, or this is really interesting that I don't see people talking about, or just like, hey, if I could recommend people go to one place, I'd say this. Take that in any direction you want, but where would you like to leave people?
Sure. Well, I mean, definitely check out the main overview of the report especially if you want to get follow-ups of anything we discussed here. But as I sort of alluded to, we're continuing to unpack this data and now look at a lot of the more specific things, like some of the why questions that I think we surfaced today. Now's the time that we're going to go back to the data and see if there are different combinations we can look at to help surface some of the whys. And we have follow-up surveys coming. And so just keep an eye out on religion research from Pew Research Center. We do lots of short read posts that are only like 1 or 2 pages as opposed to 400 that hopefully will be following up on a lot of the discussion that comes out around this. And I would also encourage people, if you're on social media, you can check out my Instagram page. It's just chip.rotolo. I regularly try to record 15 to 30-second snippets of new things that I'm finding from this data set or that speak to something happening in the news. And our main organizational account, Pew Research Center, is trying to do more of that as well. So I hope you will join me. My brand on my page is building community around learning and living well. So I love when people join and start engaging and asking questions. And this has been really great. I'd love to come back when we have some of those new surveys and unpack more of the findings with you, Austin.
That would be an absolute pleasure. We'll stay in touch, and I can't recommend enough. Chip is a high-quality follow on Instagram, so be sure to do that. The link will be in the description down below. But Chip, thank you so much.